Hello, this is episode 77, podcast called Blood and Rain. I'm your host, Arthur Dane. There was a little belt tightening in the Riley home these past years. While the nation waited in bread lines and the heartland was swallowed in clouds of dust, John was making money hand over fist in his whiskey business. President Van Horn invited him to the White House, and Rose ate lunch with the First Lady, who Rose referred to as the cow, and a journalist that Rose found distasteful. She never mentioned the lunch again, except to say the meal and her company made her ill. John's meeting with the president went much smoother. He'd been offered a job. The Securities and Exchange Commission was a new body in charge of regulating Wall Street and making sure the thievery that led to Black Tuesday were things of the past. To John, it was like he were a fox put in charge of guarding the henhouse. He'd put an end to insider trading while being fed tips and advice from friends and people who wanted to be friendly to him. In his neighborhood, John thought the greatest sign of respect came when people called him Mr. Riley. It was a whole different affair from being called Mr. Chairman. There was no difference between his time on the streets and his time as a gentleman. They were all crooks to him. They just played on different boards. And that was an excerpt from the source text of today's recording, today's stream, the second book of today's guest, T.R. Hudson, titled The Perfect and the Wicked. Thank you so much for being here again, TR. Welcome back.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Arthur.
My pleasure. As I was saying to you before we went live, it was a really pleasant surprise to see that you had written a second book so quickly. I thought I'd have to wait a year for the Kennedy book that you and I talked about in our first recording, and I was very happy to receive the PDF from you, and I was very happy to hear about it on your appearance on Jay Bird. And I actually read it back in October, I think, and I think I finished it in about a day as a real page turn. And I don't think that I really fully understood the magnitude of the Kennedys viscerally until I read your book, if I'm being completely honest.
And it was, like we discussed last time, it's a really personal story for me just because of my upbringing and my sort of, background. A lot of the Kennedy mythos comes from the fact that they were Irish, right? Irish Catholics, and that they were the darling of the media class in this country. And it did signal to me a changing of the guard, let's say, which I think is important right now. Like we're having a moment in this country where we'll say heritage Americans are realizing that the country doesn't work for them the way it worked for their grandparents. And I kind of see the Kennedy White House as maybe not the first, but certainly one of the biggest changes in that direction.
Yeah, I think the sort of the track from sort of pre-Roosevelt stand-in, President Van Horn, to the Van Horn administration, to that rise of sort of the civil rights era of the 60s, sort of the coalition deals of the non-Anglo. It was really interesting was seeing your main, who's basically Joseph Kennedy and John Riley, have this sort of panic and realizing that his sons haven't had this idea of a coalition as opposed to appealing to the base that he really desperately wanted to be a part of. And you and I spoke last time about how, and I was somewhat perplexed, if I'm being honest. Like I read a lot about the Kennedys, but I had never seen it in the perspective that you had said to me before. You said, I think it really did something in this country. See Kennedy, an Irishman, be president. When you look at Kennedy, like, yeah, there's some minor distinctions and features between Irishmen and Anglos, and the previous president was a Texan German, and Dwight Eisenhower. Although I'm actually can't quite remember he's a Texan. I might be confusing him with Chester Nimitz, but a German descent nonetheless. And it sort of perplexed me. I was like, well, aesthetically they're very similar. And Thomas 777 had even made a similar comment recently on that on Pete Canonis' show. But you start to feel the magnitude of that. There's almost like a horror that uh, John Riley slash Joseph Kennedy has when he realizes that his sons have destabilized the very thing that he was trying to capture in the first place. Is that kind of the center of that in terms of John Riley's dilemma for you?
Oh, definitely. I would say that what I was trying to get across is no matter what you try to build yourself to be, you're not an atomized individual as much as society's trying to make us become that. You are an extension of your father, and your children are an extension of you. So all the bad habits or all the virtues that you have were passed down to you, more or less, and it's your responsibility to pass those down to your children as well. So you have the protagonist John Riley, who comes from very very little, comes from this shanty Irish background. He makes something of himself, but the traits that he sort of abhorred in his father were passed down to him somewhat. He kind of fights against that, and those traits also show up in his children, who he did a poor job in raising and in trying to expunge those traits, let's say. I think that when it comes to the Irish specifically, I think that there's a level of resentment towards England and the British, which, fair or not, I'm not really here to judge that. But there are no really great Irish statesmen. There are plenty of poets, plenty of writers, plenty of musicians, even, uh, but no one on the level of, say, a Pitt the Elder, a Metternich, or and I mean that makes sense because Ireland was also basically a colony for much of its existence, so you wouldn't expect uh, that sort of man to come out of there. But when there's opportunity in a place like America, there's there's the want of power, let's say, without maybe the steadiness to wield it.
Yeah, it's almost like there was more of an illusion back then that you could sort of appeal to something. You could actually be a part of something than in this era. Because in this era, there's nothing really to be a part of. It is a lot more atomized. Um, it's almost it's interesting in the sense that you had these different groups of Ellis Island class people, and some were predisposed to being um, I wouldn't say necessarily good at statecraft. I wouldn't necessarily say that Eisenhower was a particularly powerful politician. I think most people would say otherwise. But he was obviously accepted by the American people, the core Anglo contingent, despite how contentious it was between Germans and Anglos for the arrival from the 1870s onward. It got to a point where it's just, well, basically you exerted the American force of will on the European continent, an overseas enemy, basically in the name of American grandeur, in the name of American might. Um, for that, you were essentially American. Before Kennedy takes office, he doesn't really do anything for the country that would warrant such a grand acceptance by the base. It's definitely a odd bedfellows, and admittedly, he had a certain level of handsomeness that it was appealing. I don't think if Kennedy was that handsome, he would have been elected, despite, or maybe Joseph Kennedy would have committed that much voter fraud in places other than just Cook County. Um, but it's interesting that there was no other fate that the Kennedys could have aside from destroying the country, because over time the establishment would have just outright rejected them, even if there was like a second Kennedy term. Um, if the Kennedys were to not sort of reach for that coalition, you wouldn't have seen a disintegration of the base. Um, how do you these are sort of like disjointed, odd questions that I'm throwing at you, because I'm still fascinated by this sort of Kennedy question of how things potentially could have gone differently. You mentioned on Jay Burden's podcast, you think if that JFK's older brother, John Kennedy, or
Joseph Kennedy Jr.
Joseph Kennedy Jr. Hadn't passed, things might have been a little bit different. Do you think that
Well,
actually is the case, or do you think biology just had too much to play here?
I mean, it was clear to everyone. You read any Kennedy biography, and Jack Kennedy was not the first choice. He was he was the second son. He was. Uh, I mean, you could even read like his Harvard entrance essay, which I did a few years ago, and it's like he's literally writing it because he has to, and he knows that he's going to get in, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a level of unseriousness to him until the war, I'd say, and his older brother Joe. I mean, he had been groomed by Joseph Kennedy Sr., right? The family was all over Boston politics and all over Massachusetts politics. The Fitzgerald family was like this political dynasty in that area of Boston. The Kennedys had held some positions as well, and like were related to this, that, and the other. Like it was a very political family, and it was clear that Joe Sr.'s ambitions were for Joe Jr. to be president. And if it hadn't been for the, uh, you know, the accident, right? Because he dies during the war in an experimental sort of airplane project. They're basically trying to create remote control airplanes. So think of like a B-25, but it's a drone,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and he dies in an accident like that. I so I've heard some people who are more conspiratorially minded than myself, and that's saying something. Say that that was an inside job, which I kind of play with a little bit in the book because I thought it was interesting and I thought it'd be fun to make certain events happen in certain ways. I don't want to give away too much, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not a direct. My novel is not a direct uh, Kennedy biography, but it does sort of hit all the beats of their tragic story. Um, but yeah, I think that Joe Jr. Uh, would have probably been well. It's tough to say. Tough to say how much the war would have changed him and his opinions. Tough to say how much he would have been made to change because he was very much enamored with mid-century Germany. Let's say he spent some time there. He saw how the society worked. Uh, Joseph Sr. is well known for his prejudices, which I actually think I tamped down in the book just because I wanted to be able to get it published or publish it places.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's such an interesting figure to me. I really do think he's like the American Faust. Uh, in more ways than just selling his soul, because he sells his children's soul for 3 years of power. 3 years of the limelight, and then like this sort of forever stamp that, oh yes, this is a cursed family. And even to this day, there's still like you'll hear about another random tragic death befalling the Kennedy family. It's I don't know. It's there's a lot of mystique there that was a lot of fun to play with.
I can imagine. Yeah, and that definitely bled through, and I think I don't necessarily want to take a tangent into the conspiratorial, but I think that is more than a bit odd that someone who essentially would have been a complete opposite reaction to the deep state created by FDR. That would have been the most reactionary president we've had in the past 100 years, really. Suddenly dies in an accident, and he's the son of a Kennedy. And he's the son of Joseph Kennedy, rather. But from what you're telling me, his views, sure he'd be hardened by war, but from what I've read, it's very little that I've read, but it seems to me that Joseph Kennedy Jr. had a bit more pedigree and had a bit more intelligence, and to put it like you put it with Jay Burden, a little less of a fuckboy attitude like JFK had, and that things would have been different. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of aspects of Kennedy that I didn't put in the Patrick Riley character, right? I put in his womanizing. I didn't put in the constant pain that he was in, because he was a very ill man, and he was, like many people of the time, he was just hopped up on amphetamines all the time, just because he was in a constant state of pain. Didn't really put that in there because, again, that's not the story I was trying to tell. I've heard comparisons to The Great Gatsby, which even when I finished writing it and I kind of put it out there to a few people, I said to myself, like, man, this would have been really great 80 years ago, but there's something about modernism that and period pieces that we can apply to our current moment, I think, better than it's funny. I was talking to because I have a podcast now that you were a guest on the other day, and I was talking to another writer, Adam Reinspecht, who wrote Mixtape Hyperborea, which you guys should all go read. And one of the things that he told me, which I completely agree with, is that it's really hard to write about this current moment right now because we have cell phones, because people are so atomized in screens that really you can only kind of put things in the far future, or you can put them set in the past as a period piece. But fiction written right now feels inauthentic because it's, and I use this example talking to him, but let's say even 10 years ago, you want to write about a girl and a guy meeting, right? You put them in a bar. You can describe the bar. You can describe what's going on. You can describe how nervous he is. He's not good at talking to women, whatever, right? Now you're describing a guy kind of staring at a phone, typing onto a phone, and then all the way in, other side of town, whatever, it's a girl staring at a phone, typing on a phone, and you already have some distance reading action on a page, but now you're creating more distance reading what somebody writes on a screen on a page, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that's a struggle of mine right now. Not to tangent on the podcast that is yet to come out. The podcast episode that is yet to come out on your podcast where we talk about Hunger by Ned Hampson. But I'm writing a book that actually is very autobiographical called Sleepless. That's, really like me struggling with having to work overnight security and living in poverty and whatnot. But a lot of the scenes that I'm writing, I'm like, how am I going to put this in that I was like texting someone, that there was like a profound conversation happening over text? This is very, very difficult. As far as this would be great if it was written 80 years ago, I actually agree. I made sure to not introduce your book as beautiful and damned.
That's all right. Paul Fahrenheit did something similar on an old Glory Club podcast, and he was like profusely apologizing to me afterwards. I think he called it like the Beautiful and the Wicked or something, and I was like, oh, that's a better title.
Yeah, I like that the perfect and the wicked actually stems from the Bible verse that you have at the beginning of the text. But yeah, I think you get what really bleeds through really well is this surging America. Like, you feel this zeitgeist of this overflowing excitement and anticipation of what many people either consciously or subconsciously are realizing will be the American century, will be the consolidation of power in the New Deal, even if it's for the wrong thing. And you have this
this big sort of zenith that comes, and afterwards there's this sort of now what, right? But what's more, usually more people are enamored with the rise than the actual peak itself, and that energy bleeds through, and you can feel that same kind of energy in pretty much any Fitzgerald book, whether it's This Side of Paradise or Beautiful and Damned or Gatsby. There's this, and it's it's something that I'm obsessed with. My listeners know I'm obsessed with. I lean more Fitzgerald than Hemingway, contrary to popular belief. But what bleeds through really well in your book and in Fitzgerald's book is that we know we're on the rise. America was never really a nation that was founded to be hegemonic, to have this kind of gravitas. And yet here we are, and it's exciting, but most people who have any kind of sense are feeling pretty nervous as to how this movie's going to end. The entire book really dripped with that energy, and I think the only reprieve that you have from that are these scenes of these baseball interlude chapters that were very enjoyable and sort of cut the tension for a split second. Do you want to explain to the listener briefly why you sort of put in these fun chapters of John Riley owning a baseball team before the Depression hit?
Yeah, sure. So a friend of mine, Billionaire Psycho, who is on Substack, everybody should go read his Substack. He understands how to write, how to market, how to make a book or make writing better, right? He's a really smart guy. I can't say enough good things about him. And when he read my manuscript, he said, "Hey, you need to show this guy having some fun with being a millionaire, right? In this era of America, right? Because yes, he's got this endless thirst and ambition, but there's got to be you have to give him an off ramp, right? You have to give him something that he struggles with. Like he could easily just leave his ambition behind and actually be happy, because that's the nature of tragedy, right? Is that it could have been different. It's not so tragic when exactly what you think is going to happen happens, but instead, if one or two things were different, if other decisions were made, maybe, and that's why the knife twist is most painful, right? So I had to give him something that he loved, that he had to give up, and that's echoed also in sort of the scenes with his daughter. But this was more intangible, more grandiose than just the relationship between father and daughter, which he messes up as well.
Yeah, there seems to be no joy that lasts very long for him. The baseball interludes included. I know you're an avid Yankees fan and enjoy baseball in general, which at least you're not a Dodgers fan. So I guess but it is kind of gruesome that this man has such an ambition to be respected in a way for whether it's his own achievements or his son's achievements or his wealth. It never seems to be good enough. The
No,
only instances, like even in baseball, the plan is for that team to be in Major League Baseball,
right?
So even in that instance, like it's not quite good enough, and that's a very admirable trait. But it gets twisted when he starts to sacrifice things that shouldn't be sacrificed. He starts to use his money to put things out of frame for people, out of the image of the family that, some people and some characters in the book seem to buy the act, pretty hook, line, and sinker. Like, oh, this man is John Riley. He's Anglo. He clearly went to university. He served in World War I. And some people, like President Van Horn, just know exactly what he is. Will go along with the charade of what he is. But when push comes to shove, will say exactly what he is to his face and not let the facade stand these I think that was it was intentional. There's a scene for the listener in the chapter rather in this not a play, well, I'm dipping back into my old acting days. But
Could be a play, I guess.
It would make actually make a fantastic play. Now that I think about it, but there's a chapter in this book where it kind of sort of comes to a headway between President Warren, basically FDR, and John Riley, Joseph Kennedy. And I'd like to speak more on the sort of Protestant Catholic divide that was a lot more prevalent in day-to-day American concerns back then, and how you link that into the text.
Yeah, I mean, back then, Catholics were, well, you know, to be blunt about it, you could say that Catholics weren't white, right? In the sense of being American. You had the main Catholic groups are, you know, Hispanic people. They're some French, but like French is kind of they have their own thing going on where a lot of them are either you're either Catholic or you're like a staunch atheist. You know, there seems to be no middle ground there. And then, you know, you have the Meds, right? So you have Spain, Italy, you know, Portugal, and that's even on Twitter today. You see guys who are you know, posting like this is what I consider heritage American, let's say, right? And yeah, the Irish are just kind of in the middle there. There's a lot of history between I mean, just the fight over Northern Ireland alone could fill up, you know, volumes and volumes of you know, what we could now call like the victim sort of autofiction, right? So when these people groups come over to the United States, and we're even seeing this now with like Ilhan Omar, right? She's talking about how she's in Congress, she's serving in the American Congress, but she's Somali first, right? There are plenty of Irish who, you know, got to some positions of prominence in the early 1900s, let's say, and they were sending money over to the IRA all the way even up to like the 70s and 80s, you know. You'd have Irish terrorists more or less coming over the United States, doing like a war bond drive almost because those ethnic ties are still there. So of course, and I realize that I lost the question there a little bit. So feel free to redirect.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how you sort of, because the climax of the book has to do with sort of, and I don't want to spoil too much of it, but President Van Horn attacks John Riley's character. He attacks his mask. He says, "You're trying to be one of us. You're trying to act like a wasp. You're trying to be this Anglo Protestant, and you are not that. You are an Irish Catholic, and this is your nature, and this is actually what I need you for." But it seemed that it had been brewing from the very beginning. So what was sort of your mindset in sort of lacing that in the story? Is that just an external force of nature in terms of the social given circumstances of the United States at that time? Or is that more close to the character, the person himself that gets struck down?
So I think wait, there's a way to answer this. I think that there is a distinct difference in the if you want to call it the psychology of Protestants versus Catholics, right? And I didn't I didn't really get it until I read Hamlet. And if you've read Hamlet, then you know that there's a lot of debate around whether it is a Protestant book or a Protestant play rather, or a Catholic play, and there's arguments for both. And if it is a Catholic play, then there was never a ghost. That was the ghost of King Hamlet, right? Who's haunting his son. That's a demon, and he's getting Hamlet to sort of do his bidding, right? And fall from grace, right? Because the aspect of Hamlet is that his father is in purgatory. The only way for his father to get out of purgatory is if he avenges him, right? That's not how purgatory works. That's not how one gets salvation. You don't, you can't be saved through vengeance, right? You can't be saved through the sins of another, let's say, because Hamlet commits murder, right? He sins. So you could see Hamlet as he fails at test of faith, right? From the Catholic perspective. But from a Protestant perspective, you're seeing Hamlet as sort of this, he is not, only God is his superior, right? So I had a lot of trouble with that, because if Hamlet's a Protestant play, then he shouldn't even really believe in monarchy whatsoever, right? One of the reasons that the monarchies in Europe fell is because of the Protestant Reformation, right? You had learned clergymen, and I'm being pretty reductive here. There's a lot more to it, but in my mind, right, there's all these people who are like, we don't need a king, we don't need a priest class, we don't need a hierarchy, because we can have relationship with God. And that's sort of, I mean, we see even in like the modern American evangelical church, right? It's devolved into the most important thing, like that you don't need to do any sort of ritual. It's just about loving Jesus, right? Which, I mean, we can get into my problems with religion in America, but I don't have that much time. So there's this sense in the United States, right, that the classes that built the country, the reason that they were able to create a republic was because they all shared the same values. They all believed themselves to be first among equals, except for God, right? God is obviously, and even your deist types, right? Even your Jefferson types would not disagree with that, I don't think. So there's this automatic tension between a people that have this sort of rugged individualism, right? This sort of needing to strike out on your own and needing to be your own master, versus a people who have been conditioned to follow a hierarchy. And what if you take one from one and put him in the deep end of the other? I guess that's what I was kind of exploring there.
That's pretty fascinating way to go about it, actually. And funnily enough, I actually haven't heard the sort of Protestant versus Catholic debate on Hamlet before. Having studied Hamlet extensively in drama school, that's something that never came up. We were also hell-bent on doing a German deconstructionist play of Hamlet called Hamlet Machine, so that's a whole other story entirely. Which is fantastic, or at least a very interesting play to read for anyone who's interested, mostly just searching on the internet. But the idea of throwing him sort of in the deep end of this world, and it's almost, what's funny about this is John Riley is by no means a practicing Catholic. It's just sort of Catholic by association, being Irish. It's like default Lapsed Catholic, much how many Greeks these days are default Lapsed Orthodox.
I mean, most Irish Catholics today in America, I'd say, are that. They're Catholic because their grandparents were Catholic. They go to Christmas and Easter, maybe.
Yeah, they feel really good, and they say we should do this next week, and they don't.
I wish. I wish it were. They'd got that.
Yeah, that was at least my father growing up. I grew up Catholic. But it was interesting about the fact that he's sort of thrown in the deep end. He's like Catholic. He's guilty of Catholicism by association. Right. He's not a practicing Catholic. He actually operates far more like a Protestant in his day-to-day affairs than he ever did a Catholic. Yet, when it comes down to it, what Van Horn sort of he tells John Riley, you will never be a part of this like you want to be. We know exactly what it is that you want, and you're not going to have it. You are this. You are not a thinking man. You are an attack dog. Because a Catholic reports to the Pope. The Protestant religion is a thinking man's religion. I'm not going to spoil the entire scene. I wanted to read that, but I think everyone listening to this should read your book and experience that for the first time.
It was a lot of fun to write, so I hope it was fun to read.
Oh, it was. I was legitimately on the edge of my seat. I was like, oh my goodness. And so he uses that. It's almost you almost have that sort of like perplexed response. Like there's a response of anger, but there's almost like a response of shock from John Riley after that. It's like, really? Like like that's what we're doing here? Like that's how I've been pigeonholed? Like there's shock and there's anger and there's anger and there's shock. Oscillating between the two. You almost with President Van Horn, it felt almost somehow even scarier than Roosevelt himself. I don't know if it's because he used a name starting with Van, but something about the Van Horn administration seemed a lot more polished and put together than sort of Roosevelt New Deal contingent that was able to have like a front face that was presentable for the most part, but when you go back and look at footage, you can actually just sort of detect something sinister in something. T7 has described, Roosevelt as a gangster in some sense, which is actually correct. You don't really get that with President Ford. You get a much, in my mind, colder, scarier form of Roosevelt, because it actually sort of felt more like an actual solid American identity, the way it was in the book, as opposed to the United States, where it was this revolution. There's no, and maybe that's because there's no whisper of a Huey Long type, no whisper of an America First type in the text. Maybe that's why. That's one of the many instances in which I'm glad it's a historical fiction that isn't like a sort of apples to apples comparison. We're dealing with New York as opposed to Massachusetts, which I much prefer personally, and I know you do as well. We're dealing with the Hamptons as opposed to Nantucket, and I actually think that's more appropriate, because when we think of Boston, when we think of Massachusetts, we don't think of the sort of Faustian fall of America. It always front and center goes to New York. It always goes to New York City. And this is sort of like I don't want to say schizo subject, like an ongoing schizo subject of this podcast, but it's been an obsession of mine for about 15 years now. You've told me that you've spent some time in New York. You have some familiarity with it. Did you see that backdrop as absolutely essential to get your point across?
I saw it as, they say write what you know, right? And I knew New York better than Boston, but I also, it's in, I see what you're saying, and I agree definitely that it's more, it's as far as cities go in America, it's a bigger player than this sort of, colonial city with a bunch of crap kind of draped on top of it. Boston's trying to be New York while also trying to keep its colonial identity. I'm not a really big fan of the city, and that's fine because I know Bostonians probably aren't a big fan of me, so feelings mutual. I'd say that I've found, because you're from California, right? I'm not making that up. Yeah, so America follows California, I think is the where California goes, America follows, or something like that, right? Is the saying. And I don't know, there's something about New York. Maybe it's because it was like it still has this reputation as like the big city, the biggest city on earth. It is everything that is both American and European at once. That, anything that happens in America, I feel like has to happen in New York for it to really count, or at least have to have New York somewhat involved.
Yeah, no, and so I think there's a truth to both statements. I mean, obviously, New York was the power center of the United States before it was ever California. Um, I think there's this sort of interesting kind of dual monarchy at play. Grant Brooks slash Spader wrote a great article about this. I forgot the exact name, but it was basically saying in terms of ideas, right now, like Silicon Valley, San Francisco, the Golden Gate is what leads, right? And that's been the case since about the 80s. But traditionally, in terms of material output, in terms of bottom line, like no one really defeats New Yorkers in terms of getting that done. They've always been more rooted in material reality and competition, and less so in abstract ideas that could be potentially, life changing, like the West is. There's more space for that in the West.
I mean, there's more, yeah. I mean, New York is just people living on top of people on this like shitty little island that is, it's like a bunch of rats being trapped in a cage, right? And
yeah,
there's something you sharpen your iron there, whereas in California, you can escape for the weekend somewhere. You can go out and go mountain climbing. You can go surfing. You can do it all in California, all within like, a couple hours drive, or at least like a short flight. New York, you can maybe escape to the Hamptons, but even that's like a massive affair with traffic or something. I mean, the traffic in California, I've heard, is horrible, but there's something congested that just forces people to have to stand out by any means necessary in New York. That I don't see that those kinds of teeth out west.
No, it's not really possible out west to the extent that it is in New York. I mean, that is the city of survival of the fittest. Like I've lived in Chicago too. Like Chicago, there's not anywhere near the amount of pressure to be at your best as there is in New York. There's a certain extent of that in Los Angeles, but it's less sort of being who's top dog on the bottom line and more having to do with who can be the most unique and who can maneuver the expanse of sprawl and be at the right place at the right time to be seen.
Yeah, LA is about like, it's so transactional. You're never interested in what another person's doing, but just how you can fit into that plan.
Absolutely.
Whereas in New York, you can have sort of a underground art scene that's cool because there's a lot of, older money behind it, let's say. Like there's not this, yeah, there's a class difference between New York and Los Angeles, I'd say.
Yeah, I don't think that California. I mean, you can have sort of San Franciscan old money, right? And it's somewhat still there. It's the Stanfords and the Crockers and the Huntingtons and the Hopkins, and it's basically railroad money, right? With Los Angeles, it's Hollywood, but it's no real sort of sense of establishment. You have your Mondavi type families in Napa, and you have the people that sort of keep the state in chains, and the Pelosi's, the Browns, the Newsoms, and whatnot. But you don't have this contingent in California that you have that clearly built this country ideologically and materially that you have back east. Like anything east of the Mississippi, like you had Chicago, and obviously Chicago has the Chicago Board of Trade, which is a big deal in terms of the actual literal transfer of physical goods. Right, you have the freshwater port, but what dictates policy to the United States, like east of the Mississippi, and even in some instances, even California, is still New York City. The money markets are in New York City. People think they're going to go to Miami. There's going to be some way that old money New Yorkers are going to prevent that, because that is the establishment that is, and my dad and I used to say this a lot. My dad's a New Yorker, so saying, you need to see the world. Like New York is the world. There's a reason why New Yorkers never leave. And my dad is never, and any New Yorker who leaves New York is never really the same. Like my dad's lived in California longer than he has in New York now, and he still says, "Well, back in New York, like you just can't shake it."
Yeah, it's funny because I no longer I lived in New York for a bit, but not for very long. But it does stay with you, and even where I live now, if somebody like approaches me and like is smiling and is kind of nice, like I'm automatically off put by that person. Like and I just think like, what the hell are you smiling at? Like you get hardened very quickly in New York because you see a lot of really depraved stuff. It's nuts. We could do a whole stream on just all the messed up stuff I've seen on the subway, and it'd be good. It'd be voyeuristic for the audience, but for anybody who's in New York, it'd be like, well, yeah, well, I caught a fish this big. I saw a rat this big. I saw the alligators in the sewer. They were fighting the Ninja Turtles or something.
Yeah, I saw a guy on top of 2 subway cars, and he's playing drums on each subway car while he's straddling it. Yes, it's one giant pissing contest, honestly.
Yeah,
which is essentially the most New York thing that could possibly
exactly
be, really.
So, oh, you're there in the 2020s or whatever. You should have been in the 70s. You're like, that's nothing. The 60s, that was when it, like it's. It's kind of like the army in that way, because like the longer you've been in the army, the more someone will tell you, oh, that's not the old army, like that's not how it used to be, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm sure in the future you and I could do a podcast specifically about the backdrop that is New York, because that is a subject that is it could be a good 10 episodes on its own.
It'll kill 100 people before you have one success, but that one success is built on the foundation of like many destroyed souls. Like there is that sort of. You said this the other day in the Hunger podcast that we did. The making it in New York means that you can make it anywhere. So like if you make it here, you make it anywhere, kind of thing. And that's kind of played for laughs these days. And even I kind of dismissed it offhand at the time. But the more I've thought about it, it's like, yeah, to truly make it in New York means that you have had to endure a lot. The city is the city wants its blood, and it's gonna get it.
Absolutely. I mean, you can either be to endure New York, you either need to become like sociopathic, in some ways, like American Psycho, honestly.
Yeah,
I'm
definitely.
not the biggest film of that book or the movie, if I'm being honest, but you kind of wind up looking like that if you're going to come out on top, or you somehow endured and become a saint within the midst of hell, which makes sense, right? Because if you have this constant invitation to compromise your morals just for the sake of getting ahead, and if you're presented with so many of those opportunities, it can snowball so quickly that is really a force of hell. And if you can continually resist that force of hell, you will sort of find heaven. Obviously, our main character has done the former, not the latter.
Yeah.
And I think the gravitas of the city sort of lends more. I don't want to say it makes it hyper real, because I don't think that's necessarily true. But I think it demonstrates the psyche of someone who wanted to be part of an establishment that would always outright reject him, but he found a way to use the American system itself that these people created to circumvent this sort of gatekeeping for the sake of his children, but also to the expense of his children's souls, and in some cases, one of his children's physical well-being. Physical
Well,
well-being.
I mean, a few of their lives, like only the only one that comes out okay in the end is the one that rejected all of it.
Yeah.
The son that succeeded is the one that rejected his father's plans for him and plans for the future, and tried to strike it out on his own and became his own man. And in a lot of sense, didn't look back.
And it's a sort of less afflicted form of the Kennedys in terms of the Kennedy curse. I mean, we had JFK Jr. basically waiting on the wings, 20 years out from being president. He was essentially the film, the Batman, the one that came out 2 years ago. There's this great scene. I don't know if you've seen it, but where Carmine Falcone, the mob boss, he kind of sees Bruce Wayne at a funeral. And this is a much younger Bruce Wayne. It's like, whoa, you have the Crown Prince. Let go. That's the Crown Prince of Gotham you have right there. That's essentially JFK Jr.
Yeah, and his death. Like I saw this the other day, and I didn't really look into it, but that's supposedly another Hillary job. Is
Yeah, he was about to run for the Senate seat that Hillary ran for.
Yeah, so and that's a fun inversion of what I wrote about, because he was seen as like the all-American heir apparent, and you have this outsider striver type with endless ambition, do what she has to do in order to get what she wants. Hillary Clinton could be, even more fascinating character to write about, but I value my own life too much.
I would not like to be a distant friend of Hillary that suddenly committed suicide at the age of blank, well before 50. Yeah. That would be, I think it's a wise decision on your part. But what's interesting with the sense, so we have Joseph Kennedy, of JFK, and we have JFK Jr. The contrast, the sort of gradient there is just the detested, reluctantly used outsider to reluctantly and basically what we know at this point, like illegitimately elected but beloved by many presidents, who became a martyr. And that sort of martyrdom created a fully accepted American darling, which is JFK Jr., who also, it wasn't necessarily a martyr, not to get conspiratorial once again, but if you look up the autopsy of JFK Jr. And Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, his wife, is inconclusive. I'll just say that for anyone who wants to go down that rabbit hole. In terms of generational efforts, you kind of talked about at the beginning that you're not atomized, right? Your actions, you're in some ways you're not really gunning for your life. You're in some instances gunning for your children's life, but in many, even biologically, this is true. Your decisions now have more bearing on your grandparents, your grandchildren than your children. And it's interesting that with time, if you want to create something lasting, it's going to be, it's going to be much later than that. It's much far past your death, basically. You have this person who says, I'm going to use the American system. I'm going to make something of this family. And down the line, JFK Jr. was rubbing shoulders with old money Upper East Side New Yorkers, and was basically accepted as one of their own. So you can make the argument that he sacrificed himself for his family to indeed be accepted, and in that case was accepted. And that is more rooted in Catholicism. That is more rooted in sort of lineage. But would you say that because JFK Jr. was widely accepted and continued to want to be a part of that, Joseph Kennedy was ultimately successful, or do you think that's too much of a stretch at the amount of tragedy his family went through?
Yeah, I'd say that he wasn't successful Well, I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to measure success here, right?
Mhm.
I'm reminded of the line, nothing's over. Yeah, nothing's ever over. It's never the end. Um,
Mhm.
so there's it. We might not know the answer to that question for another 50 years. Let's say,
Mhm.
um, depending on how. Oh, probably not Bobby Jr., but some other Kennedy. Maybe yeah, we have redheaded Caesar lying in the lurch. Uh, very very difficult to say whether he succeeded. Right now, it seems like he didn't. I mean, yes, he created a political dynasty, but it was mile long and an inch deep. You know,
Mm.
and the current crop of Kennedy politicians maybe make it to the House of Representatives. They're a museum piece now. There's too many other players on the field, and in some respects, the Kennedys are like too big of a family to put all their eggs behind one son. You know,
Mhm.
everybody thinks that they're the heir apparent, uh, which is what happens to every kind of dynasty. You have too many sons, and uh, they break apart the kingdom.
Yeah, the downside of the 10 kid strategy that is perpetuated throughout the right, and rightfully so at the moment, considering our demographical given circumstances at this moment in time. Um, but I think down the line, I mean, I think there is a potential, like you said, kind of for redheaded season with the growing competency crisis. I was listening to Edward Dutton's appearance in Jay Bird, and they were talking about how the right and the left are both getting dumber. The left is getting much dumber, uh, much faster than the right. So we will see some kind of opposite reaction. Um, it'd be if the Kennedys maintain some semblance of competency in the future, um, maybe that'll come to pass, and maybe Joseph Kennedy's efforts weren't in vain. But I think it's a lesson for all of us that um, I'm sure Joseph Kennedy would have preferred to have been around in a time of collapse or scramble that may or may not be down the line in a few decades. But alas, he had to use his given circumstances, and well, now we have this legacy that we write fiction about, you especially, and it was one of the most enjoyable books I've ever read, not just last year. For the listeners, um, everyone should go pick up a copy. I'll add that link in the show notes. And TR, where can people find you, and of course the Double Dealer magazine that you oversee?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at tr_Hudson. I'm one third of the Double Dealer magazine. That's at DBL_dealer. We're a fiction magazine. I have a podcast on there called Cannon Fodder. You can find that on our Substack, the Double Dealer Substack.com, thedoubledealer.substack.com. There we go. Yeah, so I have a few essays there. There's a few paid promotions. Arthur, you're one of our patrons there, so I thank you for that, because
Absolutely.
what we're trying to do is we're putting out quarterly magazines from made of fiction submitted to us by anybody out there who we think is good. We're paying writers to write for us. We're paying artists to create art for us. We're really trying to do our part in the creation of patronage networks. So by patronizing us, you are actually patronizing, the next great artists of our scene, and maybe of Western civilization if we're if we're successful enough. That's definitely the goal for us, and we see it as achievable. So we hope that you can jump on board.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I might just have a submission for next. Hopefully it's up to snuff. And any writers listening to this, send your submissions their way. It's a fantastic magazine, the first to publish Hemingway. Yeah, is that correct?
Yes, the original. This is a rebirth of the Double Dealer magazine from the 1920s. They were the first magazine to publish Hemingway, and we are sort of we know the person who holds the copyright, so we are moving that forward.
Excellent.
Yes,
Everyone,
our next issue is coming out around the equinox, around the spring equinox. So, get those submissions in soon. I'm the editor for this issue. We rotate who's editor depending on the issue. So this issue coming out, I'll be editing. So really looking forward to what you guys have for me. We've already got a few submissions in. It's looking like good stuff. And I'll put out as many or as few as deserve to be there. If it's a really long book, then it's a really long book. If it's not, well, then you'll know that quality always comes first.
Excellent. No other way for our side of things. Everyone, TR, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And to listeners, follow TR on Twitter. Subscribe to the Double Dealer. Pick up a copy of The Perfect and the Wicked. And as always, good night, good storms. God bless. Thank you.